They arrived in silence. 2,500 men who had once marched under the burning sun of North Africa now stood shoulder to shoulder on the deck of a transport ship, faces drawn, uniforms stiff with salt and dust. The Statue of Liberty was just a faint silhouette beyond the fog, too distant, too calm to be real. No one spoke. Only the groan of chains, the slap of water against the hull, and the muffled orders of American guards drifted through the air. The German soldiers had been prisoners for weeks, shuffled through desert camps, stripped of weapons and pride. Now, as the skyline of New York rose before them, they braced for what they believed would come next. Hanging, starvation, beatings, whatever punishment victors reserved for the defeated. One of them, a mechanic named Otto Klein, leaned on the rail, his hands trembling. In America, he whispered to the man beside him, "They'll hang us, or let us starve." But the man didn't answer. None of them did. Their eyes fixed on the strange, glittering city that had lived in enemy propaganda as a nest of decadence and decay. What they saw instead was order, cranes turning in rhythm, barges sliding across the water, docks lined with trucks. No ruins. No smoke. The country they had been told was weak looked impossibly alive. The ship slowed, tugboats circling like patient herders. On the pier below, American soldiers waited. Clean uniforms, sunburned faces, rifles slung low, relaxed. No shouting, no raised weapons. Just a few curious stares and the faint smell of coffee from a canteen somewhere on shore. When the gangway dropped, the Germans hesitated. "AUS," Sergeant called out, calm and flat. "Form ranks. No rush." His accent sounded foreign to them, too soft for an order. The first line moved, boots thudding against the wooden ramp. They expected dogs, insults, humiliation. Instead, each man's name was checked against a list. The Americans took their fingerprints, examined their tags, and handed them canteens of water. Real water, cold, clean, with a taste like metal and mercy. Klein held his cup for a long time before drinking. He couldn't remember the last time someone had given him something without demand or threat. Around him, men murmured in disbelief. One even laughed, a short, nervous sound that made others flinch. On the dock, journalists watched from behind a rope line. A few photographers snapped pictures, enemy soldiers stepping onto American soil. Headlines the next day would read, "First German POWs arrive in U.S." The photos showed tired men with hollow eyes and expressions caught between suspicion and relief. The prisoners were herded onto trucks. The engines coughed to life, and the convoy rolled out through the city's edge. Along the route, civilians stopped to stare, women in factory uniforms, boys on bicycles, a man with a newspaper folded under his arm. No one spat. No one shouted. Some even waved. Inside the trucks, the prisoners watched through the slats. They saw tidy houses, parks, grocery stores with full windows, a kind of abundance that felt obscene after months of rations and dust. One young private whispered, "They're not starving, not even the poor ones." Another muttered, "It's all fake. They built it for us to see." But the illusion didn't break. The trucks kept rolling, hour after hour, until the city gave way to fields and the hum of summer insects. When they finally stopped at a fenced compound near the rail lines, the prisoners were exhausted. Their fear hardened into a quiet fatalism. A wooden sign read, U.S. Army Camp Shelby, prisoner of war area. The guards ordered them to line up again. The sun was low, slicing the yard in long gold shadows. Across the wire fence, American soldiers lounged by a barracks porch, laughing at something over a radio. The prisoners waited for commands that never came. Instead, an officer approached, tall, middle-aged, with a clipboard under his arm. His tone was measured, almost polite. "You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention," he said. "You are soldiers, not criminals. Follow orders, and you will have no trouble." The words didn't fit. They sounded rehearsed, impossible. A few prisoners exchanged glances, trying to translate them into cruelty, into trickery. None could. That night, under the buzzing of floodlights, the camp grew quiet. Men sat on their bunks, staring at the wooden walls, still waiting for the punishment that hadn't come. Somewhere outside, a train whistle cut the dark, long, low, almost mournful. Klein took out a stub of pencil and began to write in the margin of his paybook. We were sure they would kill us. Instead, they asked our names and offered us water. He didn't know it yet, but the shock was only beginning. For in the morning, they would be marched to a hall that smelled of coffee and roasted meat. And the next thing they'd be given would challenge everything they thought they knew about the enemy. The real surprise was waiting at the dining hall. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel. They entered the mess hall in silence, 2 by 2, boots heavy on the wooden floor. The smell hit them before the sound did. Roasted beef, onions sizzling on hot metal, fresh coffee. Steam drifted from deep steel vats. The air was warm, thick, unreal. To men who had marched through sand and starvation, it smelled like another planet. An American lieutenant waited by the door, clipboard tucked under his arm. One at a time, he said. Tray, utensils, keep moving. His voice was even, professional, not cruel. The first prisoner stepped forward cautiously. The ladle fell, beef stew, thick gravy, a scoop of potatoes, a slice of white bread, green beans, and, at the end of the line, a piece of apple pie that glistened under the lights. They stared at their plates, waiting for the catch. A man whispered, "It's a trick." Another muttered, "Eat nothing." But the cook behind the counter only said, "Eat up, boys. You're not in Africa anymore." His apron was stained, his tone casual, almost kind. The prisoners sat at long tables, uncertain. Spoons hovered above plates. Then one man, a corporal from the Africa Corps, lifted his fork, took a bite, and didn't stop. Around him, the others followed. Metal clinked. The silence broke into small, cautious sounds of eating. The stew was salty and real, the bread soft, the coffee bitter enough to feel alive again. Halfway through the meal, one of the older sergeants set his fork down and pressed a hand to his face. His shoulders shook. The guard watching nearby didn't move. The sergeant murmured, "Entschuldigung," as if apologizing for being human. At the far end, Otto Klein looked at the pie on his tray. He hadn't seen sugar in months. He tasted it slowly, like a man testing a dream. It was warm, sweet, impossible. When he looked up, an American guard was watching him. "Good?" the guard asked. Klein hesitated, then nodded once. "Good." Around the room, disbelief began to turn into confusion. These were not the conquerors they'd been told to expect. No shouting, no mockery, no revenge. The guard spoke softly, almost bored. A medic passed between tables checking for fever, not discipline. The walls were painted pale yellow, the windows open to the summer heat. It all felt deliberate, a message in every small kindness. On the wall hung a sign, "Meals provided according to the Geneva Convention." None of them knew the exact words of that treaty, but they could feel it. An order of things that made sense only here, in captivity. "Why?" someone whispered. "Why feed the enemy like this?" No one answered, but the question stayed in the air like smoke. Afterward, the prisoners lined up again, returning trays, some still half full because they couldn't finish. A cook scraped leftovers into a bin and wiped the counter clean. "Tomorrow's beef stew," he said, almost cheerfully. "You'll like it better." Outside, the Mississippi heat pressed down on the camp. Guards leaned against posts, smoking, chatting about baseball. Through the fence, prisoners could see a stretch of open field, green, quiet, impossibly peaceful. One of them said, "If this is prison, then what is freedom?" Later that afternoon, the camp captain read the rules in clear English. "You will work, you will be paid, you will have mail and medical care. You are soldiers, not criminals." His tone was firm but calm. "Follow orders, and you'll be treated fairly." The words landed heavily. Some prisoners refused to believe them. Others clung to them, as if they were the last piece of meaning left. That night, the barracks were silent. Men lay awake, thinking of home, of mothers who would not believe this story. The coffee's taste still lingered on their tongues. Klein took out his small notebook and wrote, "In the enemy's camp, I have eaten more than in my own army. Maybe they are winning not because they fight better, but because they believe in something we don't understand." A train whistle echoed across the dark. Somewhere, a guard turned down a radio playing soft jazz. The night smelled of pine and hot metal. The men drifted into uneasy sleep, not from fear of pain, but from the weight of doubt. They didn't know it yet, but that meal had been more than food. It was the first move in a quiet war, one fought not with rifles, but with kindness. And by morning, it would begin in earnest. By the end of that first week, the word camp no longer sounded like punishment. It sounded like a strange kind of pause, an uneasy quiet between two worlds. The Germans woke to the sound of a bugle, filed out for roll call, and found themselves surrounded not by barbed cruelty, but by order. The fences were tall, yes, but beyond them stretched open fields, white houses, rows of corn. America looked like a photograph of peace. Each day followed a rhythm. Breakfast at 6, oatmeal, milk, and eggs. Work assignments at 7. Some men were sent to sawmills, others to farms, road crews, or warehouses. They were paid 80 cents a day, handed small paper coupons redeemable at the camp canteen. It was legal, official, stamped with an eagle, not a swastika. At first, they refused the money. "We are prisoners, not workers," an officer protested. The American major shrugged. "Suit yourself." But the others seemed hungry for cigarettes. Within days, even the proudest took the coupons. By the second week, the canteen stock of tobacco and chocolate ran low. The work was hard, but it was life. They fixed fences, built irrigation ditches, stacked hay. Farmers nodded from tractors, sometimes waved. A few even tried speaking to them. Slow English, clumsy German. "Good work, Fritz," one farmer said, smiling through tobacco-stained teeth. The nickname stung, but the tone didn't. The first time Otto Klein was assigned to a cotton field, he expected to feel humiliation. Instead, he felt something simpler. Exhaustion, then calm. The sun beat down, the air shimmered, and for the first time in years, no one was shooting at him. That night, when the guards collected their tools, one of them, a red-headed sergeant from Ohio, handed Klein a bottle of water. "You did good," he said. Klein stared, uncertain how to reply. Compliments had no place in captivity. "Thank you," he muttered. The word tasted unfamiliar. In the evenings, the prisoners were free to walk inside the compound. Some played football, others carved small wooden figures, trading them for soap or matches. The camp library, a converted barrack, held shelves of donated books, Mark Twain, Hemingway, even Goethe. The guards didn't censor them. "If a book can start a war," one American joked, "maybe it can end one too." At first, the Germans laughed bitterly. But curiosity crept in. They began reading, arguing, thinking, something their officers had once called dangerous. The American staff encouraged it. They played jazz over the camp radio, screened films once a week. The first movie was It's a Wonderful Life. Many didn't understand the dialogue, but they understood the faces, ordinary people, struggling, forgiving. It was strange, disarming. Soon, conversations shifted. Not about battles or medals, but about home, about what would come after. Some still clung to Hitler's promises, quoting speeches like scripture. Others stayed quiet, ashamed of how hollow those words now sounded. "He said we'd rebuild Europe," one muttered. "All I see rebuilt is my appetite." Rumors spread of other camps, of how the Americans treated Italians, Japanese, even German officers. All the same, food, work, respect. It didn't make sense. If this was propaganda, it was too generous to be real. In Washington, it was strategy, a policy designed not to punish, but to teach. "We're fighting the Nazi idea," a War Department memo said. Not every man who wore the uniform. That memo never reached the prisoners, but they could feel its logic pressing against their worldviews, quietly, persistently. For Klein, the breaking point came during a rainstorm. He was helping unload crates at a rail depot when lightning split the horizon. The guards called them in under a shed, tossing them blankets. "No sense catching cold," one said. It was such a simple phrase, but it lodged deep. For years he had believed that mercy was weakness, that compassion was treason. Now, soaked and shivering beside the men he'd once called enemies, he wasn't so sure. That night he wrote in his journal, "They treat us as men. It frightens me more than bullets." Inside the barracks, talk was turning dangerous. Some officers tried to reassert control, lecturing, shouting, warning of American lies. But doubt is contagious. One private whispered to another, "If they feed us, clothe us, pay us, are they still the enemy?" His friend didn't answer. He was listening to the jazz coming through the guardhouse radio, a slow trumpet line that sounded nothing like war. In August, a new notice appeared on the bulletin board: education program, voluntary. The Americans were offering classes, English, math, civics. The word civics puzzled them. A few signed up, just to see. The teachers were ordinary soldiers with patient voices and chalk-stained fingers. They didn't lecture about freedom or democracy. They asked questions. What does fairness mean? What makes a good leader? For men raised on orders, questions felt like ambushes. But the more they answered, the less their old certainties fit. Evenings grew quieter. The guards stopped locking the inner barracks doors. They didn't need to. There was nowhere to run, and, strangely, no desire to. Many began to sense that something irreversible was happening, not to their bodies, but to their beliefs. One night, a young guard stood by the wire, smoking. A German sergeant approached and asked in halting English, "Why do you treat us so well?" The guard shrugged. "Because you'll go home someday, and we'd rather you take this with you than what you came with." The sergeant didn't reply. He just nodded, slowly, as if the words had cut deeper than any bullet. That question, "Why mercy?" would echo through every bunk that night. For some, it brought comfort. For others, shame. But for all of them, it marked the moment when the war, their war, truly ended. By winter of 1944, the war outside the fences was reaching its most brutal stage. But inside Camp Shelby, something unexpected was happening. The guards noticed it first. The men who had once marched like machines now walked like neighbors. They were still prisoners, but they had begun to live again. The first sign came one cold morning in December. An American captain doing his rounds stopped near the barracks when he heard voices. Low, steady, layered. It wasn't conversation. It was song. The Germans were singing. The melody rose through the chill air, familiar and foreign all at once. Still knacked, Heilige knacked. The captain stood still, gloved hands at his sides, listening as the notes floated across the compound. There was no anger in it, no defiance, just homesickness. When the last verse faded, he turned to the sergeant beside him. "Don't break it up," he said quietly. "Let them finish." That evening, a guard brought in a few bars of chocolate from the canteen and left them on a bunk. Another followed with a tin of coffee. Soon, every barack smelled faintly of cocoa and would smoke. The Americans could have called it charity. The Germans called it Christmas. The camp officers decided to allow a celebration. Tables were pushed together in the recreation hall. Someone found candles. A few prisoners built a small nativity scene out of scrap wood and painted it with melted crayons. When the Americans entered to check on them, the Germans stood and nodded, not saluting, just acknowledging. For the first time, no one reached for their hats. A young prisoner named Ernst Weber, once a music student in Leipzig, asked permission to organize a choir. The captain agreed. "If they sing, they're not fighting," he told his superiors. Weber spent hours copying notes by hand, building harmonies from memory. On Christmas Eve, under bare bulbs and paper stars, the choir sang "O Du Fröhliche and Silent Night." Outside, the guards stopped their patrol to listen. One of them whispered, "Doesn't sound like enemies." When the song ended, there was a pause, then quiet applause, awkward but sincere. Someone passed around mugs of coffee. The Germans, out of habit, waited for orders. Instead, the Americans raised their cups. "Merry Christmas," one said. The words hung in the air, fragile and enormous. A few of the prisoners repeated them, slowly, as though learning a new prayer. After that night, the camp changed. Permission came for small clubs, a theater group, a debating circle, even a library. Books arrived in crates from the Red Cross. Dickens, Shakespeare, Twain, alongside pamphlets on history and democracy. Weber, the musician, became the camp librarian. He began to read every book he could find, translating aloud for others. He'd been taught that democracy was chaos, that freedom bred weakness. But the story said otherwise. They spoke of resilience, compromise, renewal. One American lieutenant wrote in his weekly report, "Music and reading calm them faster than lectures." Maybe that's what peace sounds like. By spring, the prisoners were running classes for one another, arithmetic, English, even economics. A corporal who had worked as a carpenter before the war began teaching basic geometry to farmhands. The Americans supplied chalk and notebooks. In return, the camp became quieter, more disciplined, less desperate. Humanity was proving more efficient than punishment. There were still arguments, of course. Some officers clung to their uniforms and their pride. "This is weakness," they warned. "They want to turn us." But the words had lost their power. When the men heard them, They thought of books, of music, of the chocolate on Christmas Eve. The walls around their beliefs were beginning to crumble. In February, the camp's small orchestra played for both sides, a Sunday concert in the open yard. Guards and prisoners stood together in the sun, while Weber's baton moved in measured arcs. The final piece was an American tune, When the Saints Go Marching In. The rhythm was lively, joyful. The prisoners clapped along. When it ended, someone laughed. The sound startled them all. Laughter, real and free, in a place built for captivity. One American sergeant, writing to his wife, tried to explain what he had witnessed. You'd think kindness would make them bold. It doesn't. It makes them human again. Maybe that's the real fight. By late 1944, the war in Europe was still burning, but in the Mississippi winter, peace was already rehearsing its first lines. The prisoners began sending letters home, not in triumph, but in wonder. The Americans treat us as men, one wrote. They teach us things I never thought worth learning. In the evenings, guards and prisoners sometimes stood on opposite sides of the fence, sharing cigarettes. The guards told stories about baseball, about wives and cars, and the taste of beer after work. The Germans listened, smiling shyly, trying to picture a life not ruled by orders and slogans. One night, as snow began to fall, Weber asked the captain if he could play something American on the camp's out-of-tune piano. The captain nodded. The first notes were halting, but soon the melody formed, Home on the Range. The guards recognized it immediately and joined in, humming off-key. The Germans didn't know the words, but they understood the longing. Home. Peace. That winter passed not with riots or despair, but with music. And somewhere between the verses, the idea of enemy began to fade. When spring came, the Americans opened the gates each morning for work details, not because they trusted their prisoners, but because trust had quietly become unnecessary. No one tried to escape. They were already halfway home, inside themselves. Yet beyond the wire, the real war raged on, cities burning, soldiers dying, armies collapsing. Inside the camp, men were learning how to be people again. And though none of them said it aloud, they all knew the truth. The world outside was still killing, but here, behind the fences, something that looked like peace had already been born. The news came without warning. On an overcast morning in late April 1945, the camp loudspeaker crackled through the mist. The English words came first, calm and official. Then the German translation followed, steady and slow. Berlin has fallen. Adolf Hitler is dead. The prisoners froze mid-step. No one spoke. The sound of boots on gravel stopped, replaced by the soft rattle of wind through barbed wire. A few exchanged glances. Others simply stared at the ground. One man crossed himself. Another whispered, "It's over." But even that sounded uncertain. An American lieutenant stepped onto the platform. "The war's done, boys," he said. "You can stand easy now." But the men didn't move. It wasn't victory, and it wasn't quite defeat. It was something emptier, the moment after an echo fades. That night, the barracks were silent. No one sang, no one argued. They sat on their bunks, staring into tin cups of cooling coffee. A young guard, not much older than they were, watched from the door. He wrote in his notebook later, "They look like men who have outlived their purpose." The next morning, the American commander issued a new order. All prisoners would attend educational screenings. They called it re-education, though in practice, it felt more like confession. The mess hall was turned into a small theater. Projectors whirred, reels clicked. The prisoners watched grainy footage of camps, Auschwitz, Buchenwald, Dachau. They saw piles of bodies, faces, silence. Some turned away. Others didn't blink. When the lights came back on, the guards didn't lecture. They handed out newspapers, real ones. Der Krieg ist verloren. The war is lost. A teacher among them, Karl Brenner, wrote a single sentence in his notebook. We believed we were defending civilization, but civilization was defending itself from us. Outside the wire, the war's end brought chaos. Inside, it brought something stranger, order without ideology. Work details continued, clearing debris, harvesting crops, repairing fences. The pay was still 80 cents a day. No one complained. The guards noticed changes they couldn't explain. The prisoners saluted less, smiled more, argued less fiercely. One American major wrote to his wife, "They stopped seeing us as their captors. Now we're just the men who didn't lie to them." In May, small work groups were allowed beyond the camp. They repaired barns, plowed fields, helped local farmers. To everyone's surprise, they came back each night, tired, sunburned, sometimes humming. One farmer from Mississippi gave 2 German workers his horses for the day. "Don't lose 'em," he said gruffly. That evening, when they returned both animals brushed and fed, he shook his head. "You treat 'em better than most men treat each other." The older of the 2 replied softly, "You trust us more than our officers did." The farmer didn't answer, just nodded. That trust became the camp's quiet miracle. Guards began leaving the gates open during the day. No one ran. What would they run to? Their homes were gone. Their country burned to dust. All they could rebuild now was themselves. In June, the education sessions changed. No more films, no slogans. Just questions. What makes a just government? What is freedom for? The Americans didn't preach. They listened. Sometimes the prisoners debated among themselves for hours. Klein, the quiet one who once wrote that mercy frightened him more than bullets, became a translator during these discussions. "We thought democracy was chaos," he said one night. "Now I think chaos was what we lived in before." Letters began arriving from home, smudged, water-stained, full of words like ruins, hunger, orphans. Some men cried silently as they read. A few asked the guards for envelopes to write back. "Tell your families you're alive," one sergeant said. "That's worth something." As months passed, the camp began to feel less like a prison and more like a waiting room for a new kind of life. The guards shared cigarettes, played cards, traded jokes. On Sundays, they even let the Germans build a small chapel out of scrap wood. A cross made from fence wire hung above the door, both symbol and irony. At Christmas, a family from town sent a parcel to the camp. Chocolate bars, knitted gloves, and a note, "Merry Christmas," from the Thompsons. The men passed the note from hand to hand, reading it in silence. "They forgive faster than we do," someone whispered. The Americans noticed, but they didn't celebrate. They just watched. They knew something profound was happening, not a surrender of arms, but of hatred. One evening, Klein and his friend Davis, a guard from Ohio, stood by the fence, sharing a cigarette. The cicadas were loud, the sky deep blue. "We used to think mercy was weakness," Klein said. Davis exhaled smoke and smiled. "And now?" Klein looked toward the horizon. "Now I think it's the only strength worth having." When official word came that all hostilities had ceased, there were no cheers, only relief. Men stood in the open yard, eyes lifted toward the flagpole. The stars and stripes flapped in the warm wind. For the first time, they didn't see an enemy's banner. They saw a symbol of what might still be possible. And as they lowered their heads, one thought passed through all of them. Quiet, undeniable. America had won the war not by breaking them, but by teaching them how to stand again. The ship moved slowly out of the harbor, cutting through gray morning water. The men stood along the rail in silence, faces turned toward the receding coastline. For many, it was the last piece of America they would ever see. The air smelled of salt and diesel. Somewhere below deck, an engine thudded like a heartbeat. No one cheered. There was nothing to cheer for. A few waved to the dock, where American soldiers watched quietly from the pier. Some of the guards raised their hands in return, a gesture that felt more like farewell than victory. Otto Klein gripped the cold railing and said softly, "I don't know if we're going home or leaving it." No one answered. By 1946, the repatriation had begun, thousands of German prisoners returning to a country that barely existed. Cities in ruins, families scattered, hunger everywhere. The men on board knew it. They had seen the photographs, heard the rumors. Yet, beneath their fear, there was something else, a quiet resolve. They were not the same men who had arrived 3 years earlier, angry and hollow. They carried something unseen, an idea of dignity learned behind fences. In their bags were small tokens, an English dictionary, a Bible, a photograph with smiling Americans, a few postcards from families in Mississippi and Texas who had written, "Take care, friend." One man still kept the knitted gloves the Thompson family had sent that Christmas. They had become talismans of kindness. On deck, the wind grew colder. The ship rocked gently, and for the first time in a long while, no one looked afraid. Instead, they spoke softly about what they had seen: democracy, debate, trust. About guards who treated them like men, not monsters. about the strange feeling of safety that had come, not from power, but from fairness. We were supposed to hate them, one man said. But they showed us what freedom looks like. Klein nodded. And what it costs. Days passed at sea. They cleaned their quarters, shared stories, sang quietly at night. It was not joy but gratitude, the fragile peace of men who had survived both war and themselves. When the European coast finally appeared through the mist, no one recognized it. The ports were broken, cranes rusted, the smell of smoke still in the air. Trucks waited on the dock, marked with the emblem of the Allied Control Council. Officers with clipboards checked names, stamped papers, waved them forward. As they disembarked, each man paused, not from fear, but from disbelief. Home looked smaller, poorer, older than memory. But they stepped down anyway. A Red Cross worker handed out bread and hot broth. "Welcome home," she said in German. The words caught in their throats. For some, there was no home left. Wives gone, houses flattened, towns erased. But still, they carried something to begin again with. Not orders, not slogans, but understanding. Later, years later, historians would write that those prisoners helped rebuild Germany's democracy, the new Germany. That they became teachers, engineers, mayors, fathers who raised their children to question, not obey. But on that morning, stepping onto the ruined dock, none of them thought of history. They thought only of survival, and of the strange mercy that had allowed them to start over. In a letter written decades later, Klein recalled that final voyage. "I went to America as a soldier of a lost cause. I left it as a student of what makes nations great. Not strength, not fear, but decency." Behind him, the ship's horn echoed once across the bay and then was silent. The water closed in around its wake. In the emptying port, a boy watched the men pass by, tired, thin, carrying duffel bags patched and torn. One of them, without thinking, handed the boy a chocolate bar wrapped in American foil. The boy's eyes widened. The man smiled faintly and walked on. That gesture, small and almost invisible, seemed to capture everything. The circle closing, the lesson complete. War had made them enemies. Captivity had made them human. And in that quiet moment between departure and beginning, they finally understood the truth. America had not conquered them. It had shown them how not to conquer again.